right, turn to 1 Corinthians 15. We'll be in this series for 2 more weeks. Oh yes, children, you go ahead and be dismissed to Children's Church. And again, even those who are older that want to take part in the Christmas program, this is your time. All right. So 1 Corinthians 15, again, got two more sermons in this, and then we'll get to some Christmas sermons. But for this morning, we're in 1 Corinthians 15. Let me get my notes in order here. So in college, I remember a friend, or really an acquaintance in the dormitory, was going to some meetings. And he was very, very excited about these meetings, and he was inviting other students in the dormitory to go, and I went to one of these, and it was a company called Primerica, and basically they were preying on college students. It was a get-rich-quick scheme. It was a pyramid scheme, and I almost fell for it, but thankfully I didn't. There was something off about it, but it was promising all kinds of wonderful things, right? If you just follow this plan, and it was selling different kinds of insurance and all that, but it was just talking about you can dream about all these things that you want, and as long as you do this, and this, then you can have these things. And I realized though that it was just too good to be true. Right? There are a lot of things in this life that seem just too good to be true, and most often it's because they are. So what about the resurrection of the dead? We've been talking about here in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is making very clear to the Corinthians that Jesus' resurrection means our resurrection. That at Christ's coming, that our dead bodies are going to be raised, right? So this isn't just some kind of eternal, disembodied existence, but this is actually being raised to new bodies and living on a perfect earth for all eternity. Does that not just sound too good to be true? That all things will be restored? Is it really believable? After all, it's a pretty bold and incredible claim, right? To say that dead bodies are going to rise when Jesus returns. Moreover, there are some kind of logistical issues to deal with. Some questions start to arise, and we'll talk about those this morning. We're going to seek to answer some tough questions about the resurrection body. And what we'll see in the end is that the raising of our bodies is not too far-fetched to believe. Rather, it is a glorious reality that awaits us. So let's look 1 Corinthians 15, beginning in verse 35. We'll see that the Corinthians are asking the same questions that I just posed, and Paul gives them an answer. So 1 Corinthians 15, beginning in verse 35. But some will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of bodies do they come? You foolish person, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And what you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body. For not all flesh is the same, but there is one kind for humans, another for animals, another for birds, another for fish. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. But the glory of the heavenly body is of one kind, and the glory of the earthly is another. There is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, another glory of the stars. For the stars differ from star to star differ in glory. Verse 42. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. What is sown in dishonor is raised in glory. What is sown in weakness is raised in power. What is sown a natural body is raised a spiritual body. And there is a natural body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. But is it not the spiritual that is first? I can't read this morning. Verse 46, but it is not the spiritual that is first, but the natural, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so are those who are of the dust. And as is the man of heaven, so also are those who are of heaven. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. Let's pray. Dear Lord, as we look closely at this text this morning, help us to understand what Paul is teaching here about the resurrection of our bodies, about the kind of bodies that we'll have. Help us to have understanding, and help us to be enthralled by this, Lord, to look forward to this promise that you've given us with hope and anticipation. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so this text begins with two questions, and these are basically the two questions that we're going to answer. And these are questions that Paul anticipates the Corinthians asking, right? He's kind of having a dialogue with himself. He says in verse 35, how are the dead raised? The first question is how. And then he says, with what kind of body will they come? So there's the how and the what. What kind? What's it like? So first, how? How will our bodies be raised? We've been talking about this a lot. Again, the first 11 verses of 1 Corinthians 15, we see just laying out the facts of Jesus' resurrection and his appearances and saying, okay, we know for certain that Christ has risen, but then that's when Paul transitions to say, okay, since Christ has risen, we will be raised. And he goes into great detail throughout the rest of 1 Corinthians 15 about this connection between Christ's resurrection and our resurrection and the guarantee of our resurrection, and now what that resurrection will be like and how we can explain it. So I've already noted a couple of reasons why this might be hard to believe. Especially, think about this, if you are a Christian speaking to an unbeliever. This might be hard enough for someone who's been raised in church all their lives, especially because, as I pointed out, we don't talk about this a lot, or at least in many churches today, the resurrection of the dead is not talked about much. We just kind of are satisfied with this idea of being in this disembodied state in heaven for all eternity. We start talking about dead bodies raising from the ground. People might say, okay, well, that sounds kind of strange. Well, especially unbelievers, right? If you're sharing the gospel with an unbeliever and you're sharing them this actually very important truth from Scripture, this promise of resurrection, it might sound kind of strange. It's a very bold and incredible claim. And then, as I said, there are some logistical issues to deal with. So first, let's just talk about the boldness of this. That this is a really big claim to make, right? That dead bodies are going to rise when Jesus returns. I'm not going to spend much time on this because what we see here in this text is, and so we've talked about this in our first couple of sermons, and we've on Sunday nights we've looked specifically at Jesus' resurrection, and we see that we can have a great deal of confidence rationally, not only spiritually but rationally, in Jesus' resurrection. Right? There is a historical case that can be made, and Paul makes it here in the first 11 verses of 1 Corinthians 15. He talks about the appearances and all of these reasons for us to believe in Jesus' resurrection. And so we can have this great confidence. And so since there is this connection between Jesus' resurrection and our resurrection, then as far as like the boldness or incredibleness of the claim, you know what? There's no problem there. Because if we can believe in Jesus' resurrection, then we see here that there is a connection with our resurrection. In fact, we have seen not only does Jesus' resurrection mean our resurrection, but Paul says very clearly that if there's no resurrection of the dead, like if we are not to be raised in the future, then not even Christ has been raised. And so it goes both ways. Jesus' resurrection and our resurrection goes hand in hand. So if you are sure of Jesus' resurrection, then you can be sure of your future resurrection. That's pretty simple. So the question, the second stumbling block might be, okay, there are some logistical issues. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the resurrection of the dead very long, you might have some questions that start to come up. Like, okay, well, what about, people's bodies have been decomposing for hundreds of years, thousands of years, maybe they've even been spread throughout all the earth. Maybe they've been cremated, and there's only ashes left, and the ashes have been spread, and maybe their ashes were thrown in the river or something. How in the world can we conceive of someone's body being raised if their body is even hardly to be accounted for? These are the kinds of questions that I think even the Corinthians were thinking of. Now, the Corinthians, they wouldn't have even considered the idea of cremation. That was something that the early church was adamantly against. But just decomposition and, well, let me give you another example. That there's no shortage of them, but this is a very interesting one. And this is in the 1600s. Roger Williams. So Roger Williams was a Puritan of the Baptist persuasion, 1600s, colonial America. He was actually the one of the first people in North America to argue for the abolition of slavery. So Roger Williams died and was buried, and it became known later on when his body, and I'm not even sure why his body was dug up, but his body was exhumed, and it was discovered that the roots of an apple tree had entered into his body, and people had been eating from this tree, unbeknownst to what was going on here. And so really the substance of his body was altered, right, as the tree soaked it up into nutrients, and it bore fruit, and people ate the fruit. So there was little something left there, but his body, the substance had changed and had been disseminated far and wide. Kind of similar situation we think about someone's ashes being spread. How in the world are we to conceive of bodily resurrection when you've got stuff like this going on? That's a very legitimate question, and again, something that was probably even bouncing around in the heads of the Corinthians. Let me give you what I think is a good answer to that question. This is a quote from Hank Hanegraaff. He says, "While orthodoxy does not dictate that every cell of our present bodies will be restored in the resurrection, it does require continuity between our earthly bodies and our heavenly bodies." Now let me pause here for a minute. The reason this is important is because some have suggested that, okay, in order to solve this problem of people's bodies being, the substance being changed and it being disseminated far and wide, that kind of thing, what if our the resurrection, what if it's not really like our bodies being raised, but it's there's not a continuity of substance, but there's a continuity of identity, right? So continuity of substance would mean that there's actually a connection. It's actually the substance of our body that is raised, and there is transformation that takes place. We'll talk about that. But nevertheless, the idea that our bodies really are raised, the physical stuff that we're made of, and that's what takes place at the resurrection. This idea of continuity of identity would be that, okay, well, it's really not our bodies that are raised. It's the same person, like as far as their identity goes, but it's really just completely new, and there's no continuity of substance, no continuity with the material stuff that we're made of. Okay, so that latter option is what some have suggested. Hank Hanegraaff, in this quote that I'm reading, is saying, no, it actually is important for us to say there's a continuity of substance. It doesn't mean that every single cell has to be restored, but there's a continuity of substance. Let me read it. Let me start at the beginning here. It says, while orthodoxy, that is right belief, right? While it does not dictate that every cell of our present bodies be restored in the resurrection, it does require continuity between our earthly bodies and our heavenly bodies. Just as there is continuity between our present bodies and the bodies we had at birth, even though all of our subatomic particles and most of our cells have been replaced, so too there will be continuity from death to resurrection, despite the fact that not every particle in our bodies will be restored. Let me pause there for a second. Do you realize that from your birth until now, that actually you are made up mostly of different stuff? Right? Your cells have been replaced. And so there's still part of you that's the same as when you were born, but your physical substance has actually changed quite a bit. And so even though I say my body is the same body now as it was when I was born, not every single cell is the same. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying with the resurrection of the dead, there is that physical connection, just as there's this connection with our body now to when we were born. There's that physical connection, but it's not necessarily every single particle. So think about someone who's been cremated, or Roger Williams, who was buried by the apple tree. He's saying at the resurrection of the dead, it doesn't mean that every single cell, every single particle has to be restored, but resurrection does require that there is some kind of connection with our physical body. There's a continuity of substance. He says, in fact, without continuity, there's no point in even using the word resurrection, right? And that makes sense, doesn't it? Why would we even call it resurrection if it wasn't a resurrection of our body? So think about Jesus' resurrection, and we'll talk about this later on this morning. But Jesus' resurrection he's the first fruits, right? This passage tells us that Jesus is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. He was the first to be raised, and we will follow. And so his resurrection is like the prototype for our resurrection. And so when Jesus rose, he left an empty tomb behind, didn't he? Because it was really his body that raised. And in fact, we read a verse last week when Jesus, during his ministry on earth, he taught that there will be a resurrection of the dead, that the dead will rise and come out of their tombs. So Jesus taught this, and Jesus' resurrection himself was there was the continuity of substance, that is, his physical body was raised. Okay? And so what we see here is that it's important to acknowledge that our physical bodies will be raised, but we don't have to brush aside these questions about cremation or decomposition. We can affirm that, okay, yes, a person's body might change and it might decay. Nevertheless, well, think about this: God made Adam and Eve from the dust. Right? He created Adam and Eve from the dust, and he can recreate us from the dust. And so there will be a resurrection, no matter what state our bodies are in. And so there's a continuity, but there also is a discontinuity, and I mentioned earlier that there's a transformation, right? Even though our bodies are raised, praise the Lord, they are going to be much different than they are now, right? And especially many of us who are suffering, maybe just the effects of old age. Not that I'm sure there's no one here that's suffering from that. But disease, or you name it. We have all of these problems that we deal with because we live in a fallen world. So praise the Lord that though it is these very bodies that will be raised, and though we will have a physical bodily resurrection, it's going to be a much more wonderful, perfect body that will not have these ailments. So there's a transformation that will take place. In fact, we have a couple of transformations that will take place as Christians. The first actually begins here and now, and that's the transformation of our spirit, right? The sanctification, right? I've talked a lot about justification, sanctification, and glorification. Remember, so justification is that point in which you come to faith in Jesus and you are justified before God, right? You are declared righteous because of what Christ has done. So that's the very beginning point. But then you begin this transformation that we call sanctification. That's growing in holiness, becoming like Christ. So that's the first transformation that we go through as Christians. And even as our bodies are wasting away, our soul is being restored. Consider this verse in 2 Corinthians 4:16. So we do not lose heart, though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. Right? And so we're at this. We're going through this process as believers where our bodies are declining, and yet our spirit is becoming more and more like Jesus. And so that's this process of sanctification. We're becoming more and more like Christ. But there's another transformation that takes place, and that is a glorification. So there's justification, sanctification, and glorification. And glorification is whenever Christ returns, and not only are we made perfect in spirit, not only is our sanctification complete, but we are glorified in that we are raised to glorious bodies like Jesus's. And so we have this transformation that takes place at Christ's return, which is what Paul is referring to here in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul uses an analogy of a seed. Look at verse 36. He responds kind of harshly to himself, right? This is a hypothetical question that he's anticipating from the Corinthians about how will the dead be raised, what kind of body will they have. He says, "You foolish person, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And what you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body." So he compares it to a seed, right? Just as you plant a seed into the ground and it sprouts, we plant our dead bodies into the ground, and at Christ's resurrection, it will raise. It's like a seed. And even though there's a continuity between the seed and the plant, they are different, aren't they? And so it is with our bodies. We sow our body into the ground, and when Christ returns, something much greater will come out of the ground. So we see that there's this analogy of the seed. And that this will transition us now to the second question, and that is, what will our resurrection bodies be like? Okay, so we've been talking about, how can we make sense of this when if our bodies are decayed and all these questions that come up. But now that we're past that, the question is, well, what exactly will our bodies be like? And the short answer is that they will be glorified physical bodies that are made to live forever with Jesus in a new earth, under a new heavens, right? All things will be restored, and we will dwell with Christ. We'll have a body like Jesus's, a glorified body. I said this, I think, a few weeks ago, but isn't it crazy that the Bible explicitly teaches something so much more wonderful than many Christians believe? So I read a poll a couple of weeks ago about Christians who affirm the resurrection of the dead. It was 63% of weekly attenders. Now, it's kind of a broad range. That included Catholics and all kinds of different Protestants and whatnot. But 63% of weekly attenders answered yes, that in the last day our bodies will be raised from the dead. That's a really sad thing, because we make up all kinds of stuff in order to make Christianity more appealing, or God forbid we do that, but so many Christians do, right? And yet, when it comes to something so glorious, right, the resurrection of the dead, living in a physical body on a physical earth for all eternity with Christ, something so wonderful that is explicitly taught in Scripture, so many Christians, they either outright deny it, or maybe they just don't know that the Bible teaches this. And we're satisfied with this idea of just having this disembodied existence for all eternity. But that is not God's plan for us. Let me read you a couple of quotes from C.S. Lewis. He says, "There is no use trying to be more spiritual than God. God never meant for man to be a purely spiritual creature. He likes matter. He invented it." And so we've talked about, in some of these past sermons, this philosophy called Gnosticism that arose kind of in the latter part of the first century. And there was kind of an early form of this that seemed to be having an influence on the Corinthians, but it still influences us even today. This idea that matter is bad and the immaterial is good. We want to escape this physical world, and we want to escape our material bodies and enter into this immaterial realm. Now, as I've sought to make it clear, the Bible does teach that when we die, that we will go to this immaterial realm. That is, our spirit will go to heaven to be with God, and that will be wonderful, right? It'll be wonderful to be in the presence of God. But God has something much greater in store for us, and that is at Christ's return. There will be the restoration of our body and the restoration of the earth, and we will be as God intended, body and soul, body and spirit. All right, so there's no use in trying to be more spiritual than God. God never meant for man to be a purely spiritual creature. He likes matter. He invented it. Here's another quote. Christianity is almost the only one of the great religions which thoroughly, and when he says great religions, he means like the popular religions of the world. It's almost the only one which thoroughly approves of the body, which believes that matter is good, that God himself once took on a human body, and that some kind of body is going to be given to us in heaven and is going to be an essential part of our happiness, our beauty, and our energy. Right? That's something very unique to Christianity, and is something that we ought to celebrate and emphasize. Quick note, but important. The resurrection of the body shows that God cares not only about our spiritual needs, but also our physical needs. Isn't that good to know that God cares about the physical as well as the spiritual? And likewise, we should care not only about others' spiritual needs, but we should also care for their physical needs. And we care for their physical needs in the here and now, but also in the life to come, recognizing that there will be a resurrection. And the resurrection of the dead, it should affect how we care for others whenever they're facing problems. Like, for example, when we're comforting someone, maybe someone who has a terminal disease, they're facing some kind of physical illness, or maybe just some kind of really dire need that, I don't know, perhaps we can do nothing about, but only comfort them. I think often the line that a Christian might give is that, someday you'll escape this and you'll be with the Lord in heaven, free from this body and free from all these problems. That's good, but there's something better. What should we comfort someone with who is facing such a terrible disease or illness or you name it? Well, we can assure them that one day all things will be made new. That one day you will have a body that is not suffering from all of these ailments. Christ is going to restore this body that is ridden with disease, this body that is so broken. God's going to, he's not just simply going to release you from it, but he's going to restore it. He's going to restore the earth. He's going to restore all things. That's how we ought to comfort someone, right? That's the biblical way. Or what about whenever we're giving aid to someone? We don't want to do it simply to alleviate their suffering until they escape this material world. Right? We think of Christians, or maybe ones that we hope to be Christians, ones that we're ministering to. Maybe missionaries go to a third world country, and we have people who are suffering from all kinds of terrible disease and poverty, and just the worst that we can imagine. We want to bring them the gospel, but it is important for us to bring them clean water, to bring them medicine, to give them food, to take care of their physical needs. Because as we've said, God not only cares about the spiritual but the physical. But as we do that, as we care for someone's physical needs, or even here in Monroe City when we're helping out the poor, we care for someone's physical needs? Do we do it to say, okay, we want to alleviate you from all these things that you're suffering until you're able to escape this material world? Or is it framed in such a way that this is a taste of what things will be like when God makes all things new? Right? We want to alleviate your suffering. We want to help you to enjoy this life, not just for the sake of getting through it and moving on to something else, but so you can see, maybe get a little taste of what is to come. So it's all about our perspective, isn't it? And I think if we have this biblical perspective of what God intends for us, that is the restoration of all things, and that's going to affect the way in which we minister to others. This is going to affect the way in which we minister to ourselves, the way we handle illness and disease and poverty and famine, anything that we might be going through ourselves. All right, so that was kind of an aside. We're looking at the question, what precisely will this body be like, this resurrected body that Paul talks about? So in verses 39 through 41, he talks about different kinds of flesh, talks about heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. And Paul's making the point here that you see that there are different kinds of animals, there are earthly bodies or heavenly bodies. There's a continuity and there's a discontinuity. Right? That's the point that he's making, that when we compare our earthly bodies to our heavenly bodies, they will be alike in some way, but there's also going to be some marked differences. He makes, in verses 42 through 44, he makes some stark contrast between the body as it is sown and the body as it is raised, right? So remember this analogy of the seed being sown into the ground and then being raised at Christ's coming. He says it's sown perishable, it's raised imperishable. It's sown in dishonor, it's raised in glory. It's sown in weakness, it's raised in power. It's sown natural, it's raised spiritual. So we see quite an improvement here. And of course, this body is made to dwell on a new earth, to match it. Now, one more consideration before we close. I want to make clear that whenever Paul says spiritual here, he does not mean non-physical. Right? Now, we can gather that, first of all, just from the context, because Paul has made quite clear that this is going to be a bodily resurrection. It's a physical body. But it might have you scratching your head here when it says that it's sown natural and it's raised spiritual. Another way we can see that spiritual here does not mean immaterial, because that might be what we would tend to think. One other reason we see that this is not the case is because this is actually a parallel with the first Adam and the last Adam, right? If we read on, look at verse 45 and 46. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. Now, who is the last Adam? Jesus, right? So there's this. So the natural body and the spiritual body are paralleled with the first Adam and the last Adam, verse 46. It is not the spiritual that is first, but the natural and then the spiritual. So the first Adam was natural, the last Adam was spiritual. Will you tell me, was Jesus raised bodily from the dead? Yes, Jesus has a physical body even now. Do you realize that? Right? Jesus was raised physically from the dead for 40 days. He appeared to the disciples and to others, and then he ascended into heaven. And so Jesus was raised physically. And so we see that the spiritual corresponds with Jesus and his physical body, while the natural corresponds with Adam. And so the contrast here is not material, immaterial, right? Natural and spiritual is not material and immaterial. In fact, the word natural here, literally it means soulish. That might throw you for a loop, right? Soulish, because soulish, like a soul, right? You're thinking immaterial. But wait, natural, that would make us think material. And of course, Adam did have a material body. We are in Adam. We right now bear the image of the man of dust, of Adam. We have physical bodies, right? So what's up with this word soulish? Well, we could get into a long discussion on that. I'm not going to. But the point here is that what it doesn't mean is made of soul, right? Soulish does not mean made of soul, and spiritual does not mean made of spirit, in this context at least. So when it says spiritual body, it does not mean a immaterial body that's just made of spirit, just as soulish or natural doesn't mean a body that's made of soul. What we see here actually is that the spiritual person is the one who has the resurrection body. That's what Paul's getting at. He's saying you really want to be spiritual. You want to know what it means to be spiritual. It is to be raised in glory as Jesus was raised in glory, right? And so that is the end of our salvation process, right? There's the justification, sanctification, glorification. Glorification is when we're raised to be like Christ, and that is when we have finally arrived. Well, let me close with this, with verses 47 through 49. He continues, "The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so also are those who are of the dust. And as is the man of heaven, so also are those who are of heaven." Verse 49. Listen to this. "Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven." So what this is telling us is that at the resurrection of the dead, we will obtain a body like Jesus's. We will bear his image. And isn't that exciting to think about? That, we often think about being a Christian as being someone who is becoming like Jesus, right? I'm a follower of Jesus. I'm a Christian. That is, I want to be like Jesus. And again, as we've pointed out, this process of sanctification is becoming like Jesus. That is, becoming like Jesus in our character, right? But being like Jesus doesn't end there. It goes all the way to glorification, to where we bear the image of the man of heaven. That is, in our physical bodies, right? And so we will be like Jesus. And you want to know what the resurrection body is like? You want to know what Jesus' body is like? Well, all you have to do is look at the Gospels, and you look at these 40 days in which Jesus was appearing to the disciples and to others, right? We see that he had a physical body, right? That is, he left behind an empty grave, and that he ate with the disciples. People touched him. He prepared breakfast. Remember when he prepared breakfast for them on the beach, right? So he was a physical body, and yet he was able to appear to them in a locked room. There was something more glorious about this new body. In fact, sometimes he wasn't even recognized. And well, like on the road to Emmaus, we're told that the Spirit kept the disciples from recognizing him. But I can imagine that he did look a little bit different, right? But at the same time, it was still Jesus, and he was recognizable besides to those on the road to Emmaus. People knew who he was, and he even had the scars in his wrists and the side, and his feet. And so there's this continuity and this discontinuity. There's this physicality, and yet it's much greater than our bodies here on earth. There's much greater capabilities. Just as Paul says here, it's Jesus' body was perishable, but it was raised imperishable. And so that's what the resurrection body will be like. And the encouragement for us is to remember that, to look forward to it, and to glory in it, right? To think, wow, not only will I be made like Jesus in my spirit and character, but also in my body in the resurrection. How glorious that will be.